Well, thank you, President McClimmon, for such a warm introduction, and thank you for honoring us with the opportunity to speak at the Oglethorpe community on Oglethorpe Day. Sarah and I have been to many Oglethorpe Day celebrations before, but never in this seat. So, again, my name is Josh Carter, and I am Jimmy Carter's grandson. And my wife and I have a long history with Oglethorpe, and my story is shorter, so I'll go first. In 2002, I graduated from McIntosh High School in Peachtree City. And I had a girlfriend that I had dated since middle school. And we wanted to stay together, but I wanted to go to Georgia Tech, and my girlfriend did not. But she found Oglethorpe and fell in love with the school. So since my girlfriend was here, I was here all the time. And at Tech, my professors knew me by my student number. But here at Oglethorpe, I was Josh. I bet I had more conversations with Oglethorpe professors than my own. I never met the president of Georgia Tech, but I knew Dr. Shaw, and he knew me. So for 23 years and counting, my girlfriend from middle school still keeps bringing me back to campus, so I'll turn it over to her. Sarah?
So my relationship with Oglethorpe goes back to 2001 when I first received a letter in the mail as a high school junior with information about the university. And the first thing that attracted me to Oglethorpe was the address on the return envelope. And that was because since Josh was dead set on going to Georgia Tech, and I was interested in exploring any college in Atlanta and finding out more about it. And however, the more that I learned about Oglethorpe, the more I fell in love with the school. My parents knew it was the right place for me from our first campus tour. And then I was invited to participate in the JU scholarship competition. And I was lucky enough to win one of those 5 scholarships given out that year. And I see Dr. Lutz in the audience. He was one of my seminar leaders during that scholarship competition. And I had a wonderful experience being on campus, having that academic challenge, meeting the other students, meeting the faculty. So JU is always one of my favorite events. And then it was really when I came to make the connection weekend that I truly fell in love with Oglethorpe. I stayed with a current student in her dorm room. Her name was Mary Straub, and she was so welcoming and so lovely. She took me around campus. She introduced me to her friends, and I left that weekend just feeling like I had made a real connection to Oglethorpe. When I started school that fall, I was wondering, will Mary really want to be my friend? She's a junior now. I was just a freshman. But it turns out that she did. I ended up joining her sorority, Sigma Sigma Sigma, and we have stayed lifelong friends. So she was a bridesmaid in my wedding first, and then I was a bridesmaid in her wedding. And I feel like that is the magic of Oglethorpe. The relationships that are built here are both deep and wide. The diversity on campus gives students an opportunity to meet people that are vastly different from them. The small classes and the close-knit community give students the opportunity to really know their peers and build lasting relationships. Can you tell as a admission counselor? But I'm not here today to sell you on Oglethorpe. We're here to talk to you about our experiences as Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter's grandchildren and how they shaped our perspective on the world.
So my grandfather had a remarkable life that our entire nation just celebrated. He was 100 years old, and I had him as a grandfather for 40 years. Sarah's been in my family since she was 15, so she got to know my grandparents for 25 years. In my family, we had an emotional and intense 9-day state funeral to honor him. I believe that we were able to celebrate my grandfather at the right time for him and the right time for our nation. The whole world watched and celebrated him, and I know that Eli set up a memorial viewing here at the library on campus, so thank you, Eli. Public grieving is a unique experience. In my family, we've had to public grieve the loss of my brother, my mom, my grandmother, and of course my grandfather. And the way it works is this. We knew my grandfather's time was coming. My dad, my uncle, and my aunt were able to go down the plains to be with him at the end. But then when he died, we had about 10 minutes of having that news to ourselves. And then the news broke. And we were flooded with support from all over the world. I got condolences from people that I have known my whole life, people that I've only met once, and people that I didn't know at all. And I had one person reach out to me that I haven't even seen since first grade. The world lost my grandfather. And in some odd way, that meant that we got him back, because my grandfather came back to us bigger than he had been in years. our private grieving stopped. And we in the family got into the business of putting on a state funeral. The very first thing I did in response to my public grieving mode was I crafted a response to the flood of texts and emails that I got reaching out to me, and I wrote this. Governor of Georgia, President of the United States, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, 100 years old, 101 Christmases, 77 years of marriage, 4 children, 12 grandchildren, 14 great-grandchildren. He spent his life fighting for America, democracy, global health, human rights, and peace. While president, he told the truth, he kept the peace, and he obeyed the law. Not bad for a peanut farmer. I thought it was a good list, but when I showed it to Sarah, she thought the list was incomplete.
So Josh showed me this list of accomplishments. We were talking about how we were going to be responding to everybody, and he said, I'm sending this. I said, well, you didn't even mention any of the 30 books he wrote, and you didn't include any of his accomplishments from his Navy career, and you didn't mention that your grandfather had won Grammy Awards for Best Spoken Word. And at the time of his death, he had won 3 awards, but now it is 4. He just recently won a 4th award for Best Audiobook.
Yeah, he and Kendrick. So, one of the questions that I get throughout my life is an obvious one. What is it like being Jimmy Carter's grandson? And that's actually a hard question for me to answer because I've never not been. My grandfather involuntarily left politics in 1981, and I was born in 1984. So when I was born, my grandfather was already former president. He had already started the Department of Education and the Department of Energy and FEMA. He had already negotiated the only lasting peace between Israel and Egypt at Camp David. He had already negotiated the Panama Canal Treaty. He had already doubled the size of America's national parks. He had already protected Alaska's wilderness. He had already negotiated a nuclear arms reduction with the USSR. He had already led the United States through our worst nuclear disaster at 3 Mile Island. He had already added more women and people of color to the executive branch than any other president combined. He had already appointed Paul Volcker to the Federal Reserve to end stagflation. He had already suffered through the energy crisis, the Iranian hostage crisis, where he brought home every hostage alive after 444 days of captivity, 6 minutes after his presidency ended. Of course, in kindergarten and first grade, I didn't know any of this. When I was in school, everyone knew who my grandfather was. Faculty, staff, classmates, random people in the grocery store. I felt bad about it because I didn't know who anybody else's grandpa was, let alone what their job was. I felt like I had missed something. I missed the assignment. Something was wrong with me. But I realized I was different when my grandfather came to my first grade class. I was used to other classmates' parents coming in and reading a story or doing a craft with us, and then they would leave. But when my grandfather came, the entire school faculty showed up in suits. And the staff lined the hallway to watch my grandfather come in. The principal and the Secret Service led my grandfather into my classroom. And I remember my grandfather signed the chalkboard. And the principal talked to my teacher and said, hey, let's varnish over the signature so it never gets erased. And that was the moment that I knew that my grandfather was special. So fast forward to today, I can say that being Jimmy Carter's grandson is a constant evolution of discovery of my grandparents' history and their principles and their lessons. But within my family, my grandparents were grandparents first, especially at their home, where they were always down to earth. Now, one of my favorite stories of my grandparents' home life comes from Sarah's first trip to Plains.
So Josh and I first met in 8th grade when we were 14 years old. My dad had just retired from a 20-year career in the U.S. Air Force, and he was hired as a Delta pilot. Our family moved from his last station of North Bay, Ontario, Canada, down to Peachtree City, Georgia, so he could start working for Delta. And that was over Christmas break when we did our move. So I come in January, and I am sitting next to a boy named Josh in my English class. And later on, he confessed that he had a crush on me all semester long. And we danced together at the 8th grade end of the year dance and have been together ever since. But I had no idea who his grandparents were until after we started dating. Almost a year into our relationship, I was invited to join your family down in Plains. And this first trip to Plains just sticks out in my memory out of all the ones that we've been on. I remember being a little nervous about meeting Josh's grandparents, but not too much. Having been an officer's kid in the military, I was used to meeting colonels and generals, and I thought the same etiquette would apply. So Josh's grandparents welcomed me into their home, and I remember Rosalynn being so warm, and Jimmy was a little bit more intimidating. On the first morning there, I bumped into him in the hallway. He was in his bathrobe, walking to his office, and I was holding my toothbrush, going to the guest bathroom to brush my teeth, and felt a little awkward, but he just smiled at me and said good morning and put me at ease. That weekend was not at all what I expected the president's house would be. We went out to the garage and we bottled Jimmy's homemade wine. There's a picture there in the middle of Josh and I helping him put the corks in. And then we all squeezed around their kitchen table, which has 2 built-in benches and some chairs pulled up, and we could pack like 10 people around this table that really sat 4 to have dinner and talk. And then the last thing that we did that was really unusual was we went coon hunting. And now we didn't actually catch any raccoons or harm any. This was just a demonstration of what the hound dogs could do. We shined a flashlight, saw the raccoon, and then left them alone. But I will never forget being out in that dark forest under a million stars, stomping through the brush and the mud with Josh, his grandfather, and the Secret Service tailing us. It was quite the trip, and for a girl that hadn't spent much time in the country, it was a unique experience. More than anything, though, I remember how Jimmy and Rosalynn were down to earth and loving grandparents. They were always grandparents first and the President and First Lady second. And from this example, we learned that no matter where you are or what you do, you should prioritize your relationships first and always be your authentic self.
Now, it was quite a trip, and the guy who trained those dogs was Southern. And I had to translate for Sarah because she couldn't understand what he was saying. He's like, all right, I'll get in the truck. And Sarah was like, what? I said, he said, get in the truck. So I had to guide to the truck and see what he was doing. But that was just Plains, and that was, and many of my grandparents' foundational principles came from their hometown. My grandparents' life ultimately revolved around Plains. Anytime my grandfather was not working for the government, either in the Navy or the governor of Georgia or president of the United States, he lived back in Plains. And Sarah and I now know just about every inch of that town. Plains,
doesn't take long.
No, it doesn't take long. Plains is a small peanut town. It's about 2.5 hours south of here. And when my grandparents were growing up, Plains had about 600 people. And today, Plains has about 600 people. During my grandfather's funeral, Ambassador Andrew Young said that it was a miracle that Jimmy Carter came from Plains. Because like many small towns in the civil rights era, Plains was governed by racism. Dr. Martin Luther King said that the sheriff of Plains was the meanest person in the world. But the miracle came because my grandfather grew up somewhat insulated from the racism at the time. When he was a boy, he grew up in a community called Archery, Georgia. And every one of his neighbors was black. All of his friends were black. And their parents were his mentors. His father, Earl Carter, my great-grandfather, was respectful of the black community, but he preserved the 1930s and 40s cultural norms. For example, if a black man needed to talk to my great-grandfather at home, he was not able to walk up to the front door and knock on the door and see if he was there. He had to loiter around the front of the house and wait to see if Earl would come out. And if he did not come out, if he wasn't monitoring the front door, then he might go get a small child to come and get Earl's attention. But my great-grandmother, Miss Lillian, had no patience for any of this. She was a nurse, and she would help anybody. Miss Lillian would go into white and black people's houses equally, and she would accept whatever payment or barter that the family could afford. She treated everyone with respect, to the point that my grandfather grew up thinking that the medical profession was immune from racial tensions of the time. And he only later learned how exceptional his mother was. When my grandparents first left Plains when my grandfather joined the Navy at the end of World War II. When they returned to Plains, when my grandfather's dad died, because my grandfather felt responsible for the family farm. This was around 1954, and it was the year of Brown versus Board of Education. Now, when my grandfather returned home, he was swamped by the White Citizens Council in Plains, which had formed in opposition to the Brown versus Board. All of the local businesses boycotted Carter Farms unless my grandfather joined the council. The people of Plains knew that my grandparents were broke, and they offered to pay us $5 annual membership fee. My grandfather responded, "I have $5, and I'd rather flush it down the toilet before I give it to you." And in response, my grandparents only made $200 that year. It was the hardest year of their marriage. But this era was one of the most formative times of their lives. My grandparents had a choice. Stay true to their unchanging principles of equality and human rights, or make a living in your own community. That was a hard choice. My grandparents knew that their principles were more important than money, and they didn't cave. Instead, my grandfather fought for what he knew was right.
Plains was always their home, but it wasn't always a happy homecoming when they went back. In her later years, Josh's grandmother liked to tell us a story about the best time of her life. One of the reasons that she was first attracted to Jimmy was his career in the Navy. She wanted to get out of the small town and see the world, and she knew being a Navy wife would give her that chance. When Jimmy told her that he was leaving the Navy, a decision he made unilaterally, one of two, and he was going to be moving the family back to Plains, she was furious and devastated. She thought that she would be stuck back in a small town and that the best part of her life was over. However, then Jimmy became active in politics, and he was elected first to the school board, then to the Georgia State Senate, then to as the governor of Georgia, and then the president of the United States. Rosalynn loved politics, and she loved working to improve the lives of the people that she met on the campaign trail. When Jimmy lost re-election in 1980, she was again devastated, and she thought that the best time of her life was over, and they returned to Plains. But then they founded the Carter Center, and they traveled the world helping people who were suffering from conflict, disease, and injustice. They worked on their passion projects, and they accomplished more than they ever dreamed possible. Josh's grandmother knew her years at the Carter Center were the best time of her life. What I've taken from this story is that you never know where your life will take you or what will happen next. For me, it's a story about hope and about taking advantage of the opportunities that come your way. They could have sat back and retired many different times, but instead they decided to take on some of the world's biggest challenges head on.
In my grandmother's eulogy, I said that my grandparents left the White House with world-changing goals. And through the work of the Carter Center, my grandparents sought to spread democracy throughout the world and to end human suffering from neglected tropical diseases. And they were remarkably successful. They monitored more than 100 elections in 40 different countries. They helped entire governments transition from dictatorships to democracies. And they've saved millions of people from blindness and disfigurement. And the Carter Center is close to eradicating guinea worm, which will be the second disease ever eradicated from the planet. On top of that, my grandmother was focused on ending the stigma of mental illness. In one of her programs, my grandmother taught journalists how to report on mental illness in a way that is thoughtful and compassionate. The Rosalynn Carter Journalism Fellows Program started in 1996 with a simple experiment. My grandmother wanted to know what would happen if she gave 5 journalists the resources they need to report on mental health. Fellows got a stipend to pay for the research, and they got mental health training and access to experts. That was it. And the program has been so wildly successful that there are now 250 Rosalynn Carter Journalist Fellows across 7 countries.
Our involvement in Josh's grandparents' work has come in stages. As Josh said earlier, his first stage came in first grade, where he learned how his grandfather was different. And then in high school, we both learned more about his presidency and history. But in college, we started attending more conferences and presentations and expert panels, and we gained a master class on the Carter presidency and the inner workings of his administration from the people who had been there running the White House. We also celebrated the Carter Center's victories with Josh's grandparents, and we were able to talk candidly with them and other former officials about their time in office. We learned how things work, and as an OU history grad, I was really excited to learn history from the people who made it. When I went to graduate school, I was so inspired by the work of the Carter Center that I decided to study international peace and conflict resolution. I learned there about the challenges of international aid work, and I saw the desperate need for more peacemakers in our world. When I told Josh's grandparents what I was going to study, they were excited. I was able to interview Josh's grandfather numerous times for primary research for the different papers I did, and he was always interested in the topics that we were discussing in class. At a family dinner after I was accepted into graduate school, he walked up behind me and handed me a book, and it was a copy of his book, Talking Peace, and he had signed it for me, and in that book, he wrote it specifically for young people that want to find a way to bring peace to their communities. And so through our continued involvement with the Carter Center, with your grandparents, we became analysts and experts. And now as parents, we have another role. We are teaching our kids about Papa Carter and Mom Carter, as we call them at home. And we're teaching them about their work to help others all around the world. My older son, Charlie, decided to do a project on the Camp David Peace Accords last fall. This was his first big project on his great-grandparents. And it was really rewarding to help him do the research and to see him connect with his great-grandparents in a way that he hasn't before. Charlie even got to do an exclusive interview for this 6th grade research project. We found out that Josh's Aunt Amy was about the same age as Charlie when the Camp David Accords were taking place. And Amy's bedroom in Aspen Lodge at Camp David shared a wall with her dad's office. So she was on the other side of the wall from where the negotiations between Sadat and Begin and President Carter were taking place. So we talked to her about her memories and her experience, and she said that nobody had ever asked her before what it was like. So Charlie got to have this exciting conversation and have an exclusive firsthand primary research experience and include this kid's perspective on history in his project. And it was another connection point he made to our family's past.
The Chamblee Middle School got an exclusive on the Camp David Accords. Pretty cool. So now Sarah and I are stepping into our leadership roles, both inside and outside of my grandparents' work. So for example, at the Carter Center last year, I got to host the new Rosalynn Carter Journalism Fellows. And last year, I welcomed 9 new ones. One was Micah Fink, and he made a podcast called Conversations with Sydney, and that's about teen suicide. And a fellow, Rebecca Sager, wrote a series on the mental health impact facing black teachers in the United States. These articles and videos and podcasts, they all make a difference to the people who find them because they need them.
Josh and I have taken this lesson of helping wherever we can, and we started the VUIBD Foundation after we went through one of the hardest times in our life. When our youngest son, Jonathan, was only 3 months old, he started experiencing gastrointestinal symptoms that were really severe, including pretty bad intestinal pain and bloody stools. After a month of testing, he was diagnosed with a rare disease called very early onset inflammatory bowel disease. If you've ever heard of Crohn's disease, this is a baby toddler's version of that. And he was only 7 months old. His gastrointestinal and his immune system were so fragile that Josh and I found ourselves in doctor's offices, urgent care, or the ER every week for the next 2 years, sometimes multiple times a week. And during this period, Josh's doctors, we had a great GI specialist, but it's just very difficult to treat. They prescribed numerous treatments, and they had all failed to control his symptoms. Jonathan was sick, he was in pain, and he was not growing as he should because his body could not absorb nutrition during that critical years as a baby and a toddler when the growth is so much. So in September of 2020, so in the pandemic, Jonathan failed another medication, and his symptoms got so bad that he was admitted to the Children's Hospital of Atlanta, Scottish Rite, just around the corner. And we initially thought we'd be there for a few days, and he ended up being inpatient for 40 straight days. We were living in that hospital. And we didn't know if we would ever find a medication that would work for our son. We were running out of hope at that point, because we had tried so many things. And we faced the possibility that we might have to resort to surgery and have Jonathan's colon removed in order to calm his symptoms. That still wouldn't be a cure, but it would just help him from being so desperately sick.
Remove your entire colon when you're 2.
So before surgery, there was one more medication that they said, we will try this. And the drug had a list price of over $25,000 a month, but it worked. And we were able to leave the hospital, and Jonathan continued to improve over several months. And finally, after 2.5 years of trial and error, when Jonathan turned 3, he was in remission. And he's been in remission since then. The drug has continued to work for him. So once the pandemic was over and Jonathan had gotten well and was able to live like a normal kid again, we were reflecting on that time period in our life and how difficult it had been, how isolating had it been, and how that search for information during his diagnosis and finding a treatment was so hard. There was really little information out there. And what we found was just little bits in different places. Maybe on one hospital's website they would mention it. I found one doctor that was doing research and he mentioned it, and I found an article he'd done for the NIH. And there just wasn't a lot out there. There was no comprehensive source of information. One place that I had found some information was I had joined a support group on Facebook for other parents. And they shared stories of hope and some ideas, and I'd go back to the doctor and ask questions based on some of the things I had heard there. But we were talking, we wish that there was a better source of information than a Facebook group, somewhere that doctors could send their patients to really receive support. And that was the kernel that gave us the idea for the VUIBD Foundation. We decided to create the organization that we wish had existed when Jonathan was first diagnosed. And so we've spent the last 2 years developing our foundation, starting with coming up with the idea, choosing a name, filing for our 501c3 status, starting to network and build partnerships, doing some fundraising, and publishing our first articles. Even at this beginning stage, with just some small donations, the VUIBD Foundation is already making a difference. Our first publication was an op-ed in the Journal of Pediatric Research. Josh was interviewed by the editor-in-chief of People magazine at the United Nations last fall, and this marked the first time that VUIBD was mentioned at the UN and in the lay press. And from these publications, we have been contacted from several families around the world and we've been able to offer them some individual guidance.
We built our foundation from the lessons that we learned from my grandparents. They touched lives all over the world, and they spent their lifetime making a difference. And they operated with a few guiding principles. Their first principle is that they did not duplicate the successful work of others. If you find someone doing the work that you find most important, find a way to help them. For example, my grandparents did not start Habitat for Humanity, even though a lot of people think they did. But they did work through that organization to build houses for people who needed homes all over the world. The second principle was that any project worth doing carries a risk of failure. That risk should not stop you. That risk should guide you as you adjust your programs or your approach. The third was that anything worth doing is hard, whether you are raising crops or eradicating disease. And it may take a really long time. So guinea worm, I mentioned earlier, is a biblical plague. It's so old that Moses wrote about it in the Old Testament. When my grandfather started fighting guinea worm in 1989, there were 3.5 million new cases that year. Last year, there were only 14, and we know where every one of them are. The final foundational principle that my grandparents had is that anybody can make a big difference. Yes, my grandparents were president and first lady of the United States, and that gives them quite an advantage, but there isn't a single project that they did all the work. They were successful because they would go into a remote African village of people who lived on $1 a day, who may be ravaged by a neglected tropical disease, and they wouldn't see hopelessness. They saw partners. They saw people who could improve their lives if they were met with compassion. And they believed that someone from a small community could change the world, and they proved it.
VUIBD is a small community. The children that have VUIBD are the smallest percentage of patients diagnosed with an inflammatory bowel disease. But despite this being a small group, we saw a need and felt that we had the ability to help in this space. That was the driving force behind our desire to start the foundation, and one of the key lessons we learned from Josh's grandparents: help where you can. When I was studying history at Oglethorpe, I had no idea where my career path would go. I couldn't imagine that I would start a nonprofit or volunteer as an election observer, or sit on a stage like this and talk to students that are sitting in the seats where I once sat. It's okay if you don't know exactly what you want to do, but I firmly believe we can all do something to make the world a better place. Whether your actions make a difference for a few people or for thousands of people, it's worth doing. At times, it may seem overwhelming or that the efforts of one person can't possibly make a significant enough impact. But Jimmy and Rosalynn's advice is simple. Do whatever you can, wherever you can, whenever you can, for as long as you can, to try to make the world a better place and make a difference. Thank you.
Sarah have graciously agreed to take a few questions. So I'm going to open up. We have microphones. I'm going to ask first if there are any students who have questions. I want to start with those students first. Yeah, she was a student like you were once. Go ahead.
There we go.
Hi, I want to thank you so much for coming here and sharing your story with us, because it is possible to make a difference, so thank you for sharing that. When you were setting up your very early onset IBD foundation, what was the biggest help to you on that journey?
That's great. What's your name?
Jordan.
Hi, Jordan. Our biggest help. You know, we had a lot of help setting it up because we didn't operate in a vacuum. We stood on the shoulders of giants. We saw my grandparents run nonprofits before. So as far as how to run the mechanics of nonprofit, just us knowing that, how a board meeting works, what the structure is, that was such a big help. One of the biggest surprises was that a lot of the work is hard and tedious. When you're setting up a foundation, you think about all the big things you can do. Like we're gonna help this community. We're going to create these assets, these resources for parents and for doctors and for caregivers around the United States, around the world. But then when you're actually in the grind doing the work, it's like, okay, well, we got to set up the give butter so people can donate to our organization. We've got to figure out how to get Google lined up so I have the correct email address, and we got to get something page posted, and we got to figure out insurance. We got to go find an office building. I mean, the mechanics of doing it was a big challenge, and we had help by seeing it done before.
Yeah.
What would be your answer?
Well, I was thinking about that you said the 501c3 process and the paperwork was actually a really good process to go through. You would think that doing all the government forms would be a pain in the neck.
Like the last thing you want to do is download an IRS form and then start working on it, right?
But it was actually very thorough, and it made us talk through a lot of the foundational principles and how we wanted the organization to run, how we wanted it to be structured, just how we would make decisions. And so having that process laid out and having us have those deep conversations triggered by those questions. And Josh, some people hire lawyers to go and do all that for them. Josh did it all. He bought a book, and then he figured out how to do it, and he did it all on his own.
Hire a lawyer for $10,000 or buy a $50 book. $50 book.
And we got it approved on the first go round, so I was really proud of him for that.
The process was really good because the process the IRS put together was basically, we want all your legalese in the bylaws, we want to see them. But really tell us what you're going to do. What community are you going to help? How are you going to help? What is your outreach? What is your plan to get money, to stay funded? What communities are you going to pull from? How are you going to, what are your touch points going to be? But these were the questions that the IRS form made us ask ourselves, made us ask each other, made us think about. So it was actually surprisingly a really good process. It was one of the most useful tools that we had.
So I would recommend to students on campus, if you're involved in an organization or a club on campus, I'm sure they have a set of bylaws. So take a chance to review those, and then see I know Sigma reviews theirs every year. I was on the Collegiate Advisory Board for several years. Take a chance to be part of that process, to review them, see if they're still working for you, see what they say, and how do you propose an amendment. So that type of learning on campus now will help you if you want to go and work in an organization in the future.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Any other students who have questions? I see one here.
Hi, my name is Catherine Rubio. So, like your son, I also had a very rare disease that didn't have a cure. I ended up getting a mastectomy for it. But I was curious, as a student, I'm also quite devoted to my disease. It's granulomatous mastitis. So I'm curious, what advice do you have as a student, for a student, I guess, on starting a nonprofit into making it actually last and be successful?
Well, we're still in the startup phase, I feel like, of ours. I feel like we've had a lot of this getting started momentum, and we're just getting the ball rolling. We've met with a group of doctors that studies VOIBD around the world, and we presented at their annual conference. We've been to speak about it at the UN, and we've had a couple publications come out. We're starting to meet with some families, but we also have so many more ideas. Like, my vision, it outpaces like the funds that we have and the time that we have to spend on it. But I would say, what is the best advice?
So when we were starting the foundation, we also found a community of people that advocate for rare diseases. Just, there's a Georgia, not Department of Rare Diseases, but a Foundation for Rare Diseases. Mm-hmm. But we found people that could help us in other ways. And other ways could be, and one of the main mentors that we have at the VOIBD Foundation is the Michael J. Fox Foundation. Now, Parkinson's and VOIBD don't have a lot in common, but what they do have in common is they're communicating to a group of patients that are not experts in the disease. So just being involved with them, they told us things that we didn't have to reinvent, like make sure your website is readable at an 8th grade level. I didn't have to reinvent that. They just told me, and I was like, oh great, free advice, I don't have to do that.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, finding those partnerships.
Finding partnerships that are, well, one, see if there's other organizations, other people out there that are already helping. If there are, you can connect with them. We connect with 2 or 3 organizations where literally one other person is working on it. So building those connections, just sharing emails, touching base every month or 2, that actually helps. But finding things that are close. I think one of the things that I keep saying about the VOIBD Foundation is our oldest son has, his best friend has an older brother with Fragile X. And inflammatory bowel disease and Fragile X are maybe 2 most dissimilar diagnoses you could probably have. But as parents, we had a lot of the similar experiences of the problem of finding your kid help, finding the right doctors, how you interface with society, how do you communicate with the school, like all the stuff that just comes with having the extra baggage of having a disease that you have to deal with that your peers might not. Those groups can give you also a lot of advice, a lot of support, a lot of help in places that you might not expect. So that's what I'd recommend.
Got one down here. Oh wait, so it's one in the back first and then one down here.
Thank you so much. My name is Kike. I had to write this down because I'm going to lose my train of thought. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us. I hope to someday make even part of the impact that you guys are making. You guys mentioned how mental health is important to you and your family. Mm-hmm. As people coming from a family with global impact, and now you guys being a family with global impact, how do you guys find yourself staying grounded and keeping the focus on your personal initiatives as well?
That's a good question. So sometimes Josh and I laugh. People will be like, can we get a picture with you? And we're like, sure. Because we live in Chamblee, down the street. We volunteer in our kids' classrooms. We're just a normal family and normal, citizens here in Atlanta. I feel like I'm just a normal alum from Oglethorpe. Like, we haven't ever seen ourselves as like special or different than anybody. But we have had to, especially through Jonathan's illness, make sure that we were taking care of our mental health, because it was extremely stressful. So some of the best advice we got at the time was, and this was sort of marriage advice, was to make sure that we were fighting the disease and not each other.
Yeah, my dad just popped out with that. It's like one of his dadisms. And
But it was really
it was such a crystallizing moment, because like Sarah and I were at each other just because of the pressure cooker of raising a newborn. And then you raise a newborn with a rare disease. And then you raise a newborn with a rare disease that no one knows anything about. So it was just pressure and pressure and pressure. And Dad was just like, fight the disease. Don't fight each other. And I was like, oh.
And we also
That's realignment.
had advice to make sure that whatever treatment decision that we chose to do next, because there were times that they said, we're not sure what'll work. These are the different things we can try. What do you want to do? And we had to decide. And we're not doctors. We made an agreement that we would decide that jointly and then not resent each other if it didn't work, because we knew there's a possibility that it would fail. And then we also found individual counseling for anxiety at times and for grief counseling. So support, we're relying on friends like Mr. Arnold and Mr. Malachi for support and in hard times. So building yourself a community, trying to find the people that you can really rely on for support and trust, and then giving yourself permission to take a break, to rest. Josh and I, when Jonathan was in the hospital, we ended up doing 24-hour shifts because we both just couldn't be there the whole time, even though we wanted to be. So we had to make sure that we could take some time away at home and sleep and eat regularly and recharge for just a minute and then go back and be full on that 24 hours that you were in the hospital with them. Because he was 2. I don't know if many of you have met 2-year-olds. They don't sit still, and they're not easily reasoned with. Yeah, and he didn't feel well, so it was sometimes hard to keep him entertained and comfortable. And we had to learn how to be medical advocates for him, because we'd been there for 2 weeks, and they're coming and trying to weigh him at 4 a.m., and we finally got him to sleep. It's like, don't wake him up. Anyways, there was a lot
There's a lot of stress.
the things that we had to learn, but we had to figure out how to communicate with one another and support one another as we were doing that and take care of ourselves.
It's also one of the things that my grandmother advocated through the Rosalynn Carter Institute for Caregivers. Is my grandmother was thrown into caregiving when she was 13. Her father died. And at 14, her grandmother died, and her aging grandfather moved in. So at 14 years old, my grandmother was helping a single mother raise a family of 4 with an aging grandfather. And it wasn't until she was running for governor, she was helping my grandfather run for governor, that she realized that what she did was caregiving. That she met other families that were single parent families trying to raise a family while taking care of another loved one. And she was like, oh, I know exactly what that life looks like. So one of the main charges of the RCI is to get people that are in a caregiving role to understand that they themselves are caregivers and that you're allowed to take care of yourself. You need to recognize that you're in a role where you need to take care of yourself. And that could be, very strong advocates for getting professional help if you need, but also make sure that you're just allowing yourself time. If every moment of your life is stress for somebody else, stress for somebody else, stress for somebody else, you're gonna break. So you have to be able to take care of yourself, and you have to recognize that you can.
So I'm gonna squeeze in one more question. We have somebody here.
Hi, I just want to say thank you guys again for coming. It was really nice hearing you guys talk. My question is, it might be a little redundant, but what was your biggest struggle or criticism that you guys faced when creating your foundation? And then what was the driving force, what made you overcome it?
I have an answer. Do you want to answer? Okay. So the biggest criticism that we have received is that the community is small. And which is true, it is. And it's so small it's neglected. And our response has been that, yes, the community is small. One, it's our kid. So we're going to do it. But the other is that this group, the support is missing. In fact, Sarah and I were up in New York a week or two ago, meeting with the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. And they recognized that VOIBD was a hole in their mission. They didn't have everything there. And the reason is because when you think about it, every other patient that interfaces with the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation has agency over their own disease. There's something that they're learning about themselves and they're making medical decisions. When you have a young child, an infant, newborn that has this disease, they're not even able to communicate what hurts, let alone make a decision for their medical health. So what we're building out is the tool sets for parents and caregivers to be able to understand how to take the entire weight of the medical decisions for your child on your shoulders and then advocate for them. So to us, we see, because we've lived it, the need. We see the need so crystal clear. So all of the criticism of our community being too small is true. I just don't care.
I would say one of the biggest struggles too right now is we're short on time and funds. So that,
we gotta prioritize.
right, yeah. So we do have to prioritize what we're going to work on, and sometimes it's one thing at a time. Sometimes Josh and I are working. A lot of times we're working after we put the kids to bed, so we'll work from like 10 to 1 in the morning or something, and that'll be when we're writing or sending emails and so it will,
Fundraising pitches.
right. So that is a struggle, and that's one we're still working on. But
Thank you so much. I hope you can see how you're already inspiring or giving momentum to the students here, and that's part of what is so special to us about this day.
I want to thank you all for swimming here.
yeah. Thank you for coming.
I'm going to invite Josh and Sarah, and for any of you who have time, to join us in an Oglethorpe Day tradition that I hope Sarah knows from her time together, Coke floats. Floating seems an appropriate term for today. So I invite all of you to join me and to greet the Carters, and let's give them one more round of applause.